Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 37 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I had such a great discussion with Litsa Williams for this episode. Litsa is the co-founder of the popular grief blog and website, What's Your Grief? And I had the pleasure of meeting her this summer at the National Alliance for Grieving Children Symposium. What's Your Grief has so many articles on every different topic related to grief and loss, and they also have a number of really innovative projects going on that might be interesting to think about trying with your teens or your kids. Some topics that Litsa and I cover include resources available on the What's Your Grief blog and website, recommendations for books and movies to read and watch with your kids, the Grief Secret Project, the Grief in 6 Words Project, the Photo Grief Project and the online grief photography class they offer, the What's Your Grief podcast, and Litsa's advice and perspective both as a grief professional and as someone who lost her own dad when she was just 18. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Litsa Williams. My guest today is Litsa Williams from the popular grief website What's Your Grief, who is joining us from her office in Baltimore. Litsa, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're here. And I'm excited to share with listeners the resources that you guys have put together on so many different grief-related topics, as well as some of the really, I think, innovative, I don't know if you call them projects or initiatives, or some of the really cool things you guys have going on that people might want to know about and think about participating in. So, first of all, What's Your Grief, and why did you start it?
Sure. So we feel like there should be a simple answer to what's your grief, but it's a little difficult to explain. Most simply, we are an online grief support community. But with that, we do a little bit of everything. So we're primarily, and we started as a blog where we would write articles several times a week about grief and bereavement, everything you could think of about grief and bereavement. And we sort of grew from there and started doing a number of side projects, creative expression projects that you mentioned, but we also do in-person trainings, we do workshops, we do continuing education for therapists, psychologists, funeral directors, anyone else who might be in the need of training around grief and bereavement support. And then we do some in-person work as well here in the community in Baltimore. We offer some support groups, work in homeless shelters, doing grief and bereavement support. So our net is wide.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it. And I think you have a co-founder as well. And what are you guys' backgrounds and how did you get into grief work in general?
Yeah, great question. So my partner is Eleanor Haley, and she's a counseling psychologist. I'm a clinical social worker, and we both were working in the field of grief and bereavement, providing in-person grief and bereavement support at an organization that worked with individuals who had experienced traumatic and unexpected losses. So we would work with families. We would actually meet them in the hospital at the time of their loved one's death. Most of those losses were things like overdoses, suicides, car accidents, gunshot wounds, strokes, heart attacks, things that were completely unexpected. And so we would work with families in that moment, sort of really trying to get through what was not so much grief as crisis, through that completely unexpected moment of loss. And then 2 years of grief and bereavement support to follow, at least 2 years. We could offer more if families needed it. And in doing that in-person work, we became more and more aware that families were looking for things beyond in-person support for a lot of reasons. Some people just like counseling and therapy was not their thing, and they didn't necessarily want to come into our workshops or our groups or meet with a counselor. Some people, it was just logistics, transportation, childcare, time, resource, all of that. And people were asking us more and more often about what existed online that they might be able to look to. And so to provide support to many of our clients, we were looking for online resources that might be a good fit for people. And in that, we really found a lot of limitations to the online support that was out there for grief and bereavement. A lot of things were really sort of vague or general. They really didn't dig into what we felt like was some of the meat of what people are going through, the day-to-day life of grief. And that was difficult. And some of them just, they were kind of boring. I would think like, this is just not something I ever would have wanted to read. And both Eleanor and I experienced personal losses that were really significant. Fairly early on, my dad died when I was 18. Eleanor's mom died when she was in her very early 20s. And then when I was in my early 20s, my sister's boyfriend, who lived with my family, died of a drug overdose. And so we sort of had these personal experiences that we brought to our work as mental health professionals and people working in the grief and bereavement field. So often when we were looking for resources, we were measuring them against not just our clients, but ourselves, and saying, would we have used this? Would this have been helpful for me? If a therapist or a counselor or social worker, if somebody had given me this, would I have read it? Would I have used it? Would it have been helpful? And oftentimes the answer was no. So we complained to each other for a long time, the way you do. And then ultimately we said, well, how hard can it be to start a website? Why don't we just, this is our area of expertise. This is what we do. We've lived it personally. We've worked in this field professionally for a long time. Let's just start writing and see if people read. And they did, and it grew and it grew, which was really kind of nice to see it grow on its own. We didn't have a budget or funders or anything like that. We were just kind of two people writing a blog, and it was great to see that need being met and people really resonating with it.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I've been on your website, and you guys have tons of articles and, all different aspects of the grief. I think some, very relevant to some people, some very relevant to other people, some going deep on this topic or that topic, or so I encourage people. In fact, I'll put a link in the show notes because I think people should go over there and take a look at what you guys have got. How many, do you have any idea how many blog posts you guys have now?
We do. We have nearly 600.
It's a lot of blog posts.
We do have a lot of blog posts. We encourage people using that search bar because if you type it in, you'll probably find something.
Yeah.
People often say, aren't you going to run out of things to write about soon? And I say to people all the time, you should see our list of unwritten articles. I think grief is just such an individual and nuanced experience. There's so many complicated layers to it in every area. I can't imagine running out of things to write about.
Yeah.
So I think that is really part of the value a lot of people find, is that we go beyond the general and we really dig into those specific experiences. And we really believe in the idea that there's long been a disconnect between the world of kind of mental health academia and the world of in-person people grieving and living that. And that a lot of what we do is just educate people about all of the things that we know and we've learned, and that there's a lot of real value in just information. And that sometimes when everything else feels completely out of control in our grief, just feeling like we can get some information and understand things a little bit more can give the tiniest sense of control.
Yeah. I love that you go deep on these topics, because I think if you were being more general, you probably would run out of blog posts after a couple dozen, right? But by going on all the different aspects and what this audience or this situation might be interested in, I think it gives you so many things to cover. That one example I'm thinking of here, you have let me see here. One of your blog posts is a list of 64 children's books. So we'll put a link in the show notes. But are there a few? What are a couple of maybe of your favorite children's books?
Oh, so this is a tough one because there's so many great children's books, but I also think it varies so much based on your child and what you're looking for. But there's a great book that I really love called Am I Like My Daddy? Which is a book that is written specifically for children whose parent, or anyone really, but a parent died when they were too young to remember that parent. And I think that's a really unique challenge for many caregivers who are taking care of kids who, ultimately don't have memories of that parent, or if they do, maybe they're very, 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 very distant memories. And I think it's a great book just to normalize that experience, to let them know they're not the only kid out there who's going through that, but also to give some really specific tools and ideas, and, to kind of give parents a place to open a discussion and think about how they can help support kids in that situation.
Yeah.
So I think that's one that I always really like because it gets to the specifics.
Right.
And another book we really, I guess this is less of a book and more of a journal, but for older kids, we really love Art with Heart's Chill and Spill journal. I think a lot of times that's for adolescents and more like adolescents and teens. And I think, unfortunately, one thing that happens when we write for adolescents and teens is, as adults, is that we create something that feels like it was written for adolescents and teens. And the last thing an adolescent or teen wants is a book that they feel like was written for adolescents and teens, right? They want it to feel like it was written for a grown-up. And I think Chill and Spill it strikes a really good balance of being a journal that they actually worked with a lot of adolescents and teens to create. And it is really created for any sort of traumatic or difficult event that a teen has gone through. And it uses blank pages to be able, whether a kid is into reading, writing, art, like to use different mediums to engage with the book. So I think that it makes it just a lot more dynamic and good for all sorts of kids, whether they're the kind that might lean a little more towards writing or a little more towards art, or just kind of reading and thinking through some of the activities.
Yeah, cool. Okay, we'll put that in the show notes too, for sure then. And how about, have you guys looked at movies or, things like that are in the grief topic that might be, interesting to parents and teens or kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are big Pixar fans, as I know many people are, but we think Inside Out is just a great movie because it really helps kids to start to understand the range of emotions that we all feel, and that idea that emotions aren't good or bad, they just are, right? And it's all about how we learn to understand our emotions and live with our emotions. And I think Inside Out gives a really great framework to talk about and think about feelings, which is so much in grief and work between parents and kids. Is just, how do we create a language that works for us? There's no one universal magic language that's going to work for every family to talk about grief, but finding a language that works for you. And I think Inside Out can provide some tools for that. The other one we love and recommend is Coco.
Yes. I was trying to think of the title of that one. Can you tell us about that one?
So I think Coco, one of the things it does so well is it reinforces this idea that our loved ones live on and we continue that relationship with our loved ones through memories, stories, traditions. And so often I think finding ways for families to normalize that and think about how they'll do it as a family is really important. We hear from so many kids, especially when they get older or become adults, who say, we never talked about it, or, I lost my mom, I lost my dad, and we hardly ever talked about her. When I had questions about her, I didn't feel like I could ask them. I felt like, we were going to make each other sad if we brought it up. And so a culture just didn't get created within the home to allow that sort of space. And I think Coco really shows how those who we've lost can still very much be part of our families, and that grief is all about how we figure out how to have a relationship with a person who's died, and that's challenging. We usually only know how to have relationships with people who are alive, and figuring out what that looks like in a family is a process that can be helped, I think, by movies like that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Cool. And I'm wondering if a widowed parent who's listening goes to your website, are there a few other maybe posts or topics that you could highlight for us that, I can put the links in the show notes, but I guess what would you draw people to maybe first?
Sure. So again, I think it depends on what you're looking for. We certainly have some posts that are just providing a lot of education about maybe understanding your child what to expect at developmental stages, how to explain certain concepts. If you've lost someone to one of those sort of difficult stigmatized losses, if you have to talk to kids about suicide and overdose and homicide and some of those topics that are hard, we have very specific posts on that. We just recently did a new post on why it's important for us to be kind of concrete and specific in our words. It was about miscarriage, but I think, again, it played on some of those other posts we've used in the past of, we don't want to go in general. We're going to give some specific ideas about what language can you use and what language to avoid. So there's those sorts of things which I can certainly send along to link to. And then on the other side, we really, with parents, know that it can become easy to sometimes become overly focused on their kids. So we actually have some posts that we always encourage parents to read that are about the different shapes that avoidance can take. Because one thing I think that sometimes parents underestimate is that sometimes they throw themselves so deeply into parenting while they're grieving that they don't tend to their own grief, or they avoid their own grief. We have people who come into some of our groups and classes, both online and in person, who will often be sometimes 10 years out from a loss and say, my last child just went off to college, and I've now realized that I didn't grieve my husband's death. Like, I spent so much time just focusing on doing everything for my kids, protecting them, keeping them safe, getting through everything I needed to do for them, that I didn't tend to my own needs and my own grief and loss. So we have some things about that too that I think can just help you to assess, is that something that could be going on, and making sure that you are keeping that balance of tending to your own grief while also tending to your kids.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, definitely want to take a look at those. Another thing I was wondering about, have you guys looked at all at different types of therapy that are available, or anything that would help people navigate that landscape in figuring out if somebody says, I know my kid or my teenager or myself needs some kind of professional help, but I'm not sure where to start. What have you guys looked at in that regard?
Yeah, we actually just did a webinar. We do a monthly webinar series, and that was exactly what we did this month's webinar on, was how do I find and get good grief support? Because one of the pieces of feedback we hear from people are people coming to us and saying, I just didn't know where to start, or I found out 8 years later that there was a grief center in my community and I didn't even know it was there. So we do have several posts where we really break down everything from types of therapy, understanding what types of therapists are, what does it mean if you go to a psychologist versus a counselor versus a social worker, what does that look like? But also looking at some of the other types of support that are outside of just traditional one-on-one counseling or support groups, because there's a lot of other options that look like for kids, things like grief camps, some of the things that are out there like that. For parents, we often see a lot of informal types of support networks that are out there that aren't just formalized groups. Sometimes there are things like weekend retreats and workshops, and then so sometimes meetup.com is, we tell people to go to all the time. It's amazing how many communities just have groups informally meeting on meetup.com who are connecting with other widows, other bereaved parents, in that capacity. My mom and her current husband met at a young widowers happy hour that was a completely informal sort of grief support event that was just organized in the community. And I think people don't always think to look out for those. Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the really creative and interesting projects you guys have going on. So one of them I know is called Grief Secrets. So can you tell us, what is that, and how did you guys get the idea to do this? Yeah, so our Grief Secret project, we actually just launched this pretty recently, and we were inspired by two things coming together. First is Post Secret, which we've always been a big fan of. Post Secret's been around since, I think they launched in 2003. Okay, wait, what is Post Secret? So Post Secret is, basically just a guy who lives down near DC, and he just started inviting people to mail him their secrets. And he's been doing it since 2003. He has received millions of secrets over the years. He exhibits them in museums and, sort of has a whole project. He has made books and all sorts of things around it. But I've always thought that it was sort of a neat concept, right? That idea that sometimes people are carrying secrets with them, and that when I would see his post secrets, the things that he would share, it was just really interesting to see the things that we carry. In grief and working with people grieving, we have always been struck by how often people carry secrets with them in their grief that they feel completely unwilling or unable to share with others. And oftentimes, either working with someone as a counselor or in a group or in a workshop or in some capacity, when someone finally is able to let that out, you can sort of see this relief of having said it out loud. And as we say in the Grief Secret Project, writing your secret down, it's not going to magically cure your secret. It's not going to make all your feelings around it go away if there's feelings of shame or guilt or blame or whatever is there. But it's a start to be able to create some space, to be able to even just acknowledge that secret and put it somewhere. So we were thinking about these two things. We were talking about grief secrets. A friend of mine had mentioned something to me that she felt like she was struggling with as a grief secret. And I said, we should create a space for this. So that's what Eleanor and I do best, is we sit around and go, well, is this what? Sure, why not? Let's just put it out there and see what happens. Uh-huh. So that's what we did, and we wrote a post about it. We created some postcards. We said, if you want postcards, we'll mail them out to you, or you can just print them and mail them into us. And people almost immediately started sending their secrets into us. They've been incredibly powerful to receive. And we just sent out about 5,000 more cards that were requested by grief centers and hospices and hospitals when we were just at the National Alliance for Grieving Children conference. So we've had a whole round of thousands more go out. And so we hope that we'll continue to get more secrets, and we'll be ultimately compiling them and sharing them online.
That's really cool. So if somebody is listening to this and they don't happen to have one of your official postcards, can they still participate, or how would they?
Absolutely. So many people have just been sending us their own cards, their own, that can send anything you want. It doesn't have to be one of our cards. We have a link on the website about it, which I can certainly share for your notes page. Or people can just mail any card or letter they would like to us. It's What's Your Grief, 3600 Roland Avenue, Baltimore, Maryland, 21211. And they are being slowly compiled, and we just ask that people make them anonymous. Unless you have unless you really would like to share them non-anonymously for some reason. But when we share them, we'll only be sharing the cards that are anonymous. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And do you have any idea how many you've gotten so far?
So far, we've probably gotten a couple hundred that have come in so far. And we just launched, a month or two ago. And so we hope that will continue. And we've only shared a few so far that have come in on social media, but the feedback that I think has been really good to hear, and much of what we hoped, is that oftentimes when people read others' secrets, even if they don't relate to the secret itself, it helps them feel a little bit less alone in the carrying of those secrets, and realizing that this is actually very, very normal, that there's many things that we often, for some reason, are not comfortable sharing. And we hope that it starts a conversation that will allow people to get a little bit more comfortable sharing some of these things, or at least knowing that they're not abnormal if they're feeling them.
Yeah. I'm curious, can you share a few with us here today? Do you have any?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. May I go and grab them?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. Well, first I'll share, because I think though many people have shared grief secrets with us over the years before we started this project, the story of how this really came to be when a friend shared something with me, and she wouldn't mind me sharing this. We were talking about her father's death, and she said to me, that she doesn't have a specific belief system in the afterlife. And she said, in some ways, I think that makes my grief, it's hard. And I wonder if it would be easier if I did. And she said, on the other hand, her dad, before he died, had a lot of mental health issues. There was a lot going on that made it very complicated, and a lot of stressors in her life. And she said, I've never said this out loud, but if I did believe in an afterlife, the thought that my dad would know how much easier my life is now that he's gone, I think it would be really hard for me to live with that thought. And, it was that idea of that I think many people struggle with, of maybe feelings of relief that happen after a death that people have a hard time labeling or have a hard time acknowledging. And that is a secret that we've seen come in a number of forms of people sharing that feeling that, maybe it did make that the end to caregiving, right, was both devastating in the loss, but also brought relief with it. And I think this is an area where I think that's a pretty common theme that we've seen. And we always encourage people to think about what relief really means. Oftentimes people think that relief means that they were glad the person died or wished that the person died, when in fact, relief is often a relief that suffering has ended. And if we could have chosen the way that suffering would end, we would have probably chosen for it to end a different way. We would have chosen for them to recover from that illness, or, get into recovery from alcohol or a substance use disorder or whatever that was. So the relief we feel is about the end of the suffering. And sometimes I think that's hard for people to distinguish. So they feel like that relief means that they were glad the person died. And so I think that's been a big grief secret theme. So I have some others that we have received. This one reads, I know I wasn't there for you when you died, but you were never there for me when you lived. This one says, after my husband, who I loved and adored with all my heart, passed away, I reconnected with an old boyfriend, and I let him move in with me for 2 months. I was so heartbroken, lonely, and depressed over the loss of my husband that I latched onto the first person to offer me comfort and a way to forget my pain for a while. I now realize that he was using me when I was weak, but I used him as well. I feel ashamed of what I did, and I pray for God and my husband to forgive me. This one says, I should have enrolled my daughter in palliative care instead of going for further surgeries. She was considered terminal after 1 year old, and I thought the surgeries would prolong her life for as long as possible. She died at 3 years. Whenever my in-laws are difficult, I think about how my dad would have been so much more reasonable, and I'm ashamed to admit it. I wish it had been Mom who died, not you.
Maybe just one more.
One more. Okay, let's see. She died in a tragic accident the day after Mother's Day. I hadn't called on Mother's Day like I usually did because I was tired and she didn't hear well, and I just didn't want to deal with the awkward silences. I still feel guilty because that's the last feeling I had before she died, and it's a stupid reason not to call, and I didn't get to tell her I loved her one more time.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those.
And thank you to everyone who shared them with us. I mean, I think these are deeply personal, and we feel so grateful that people have trusted us to share them. And I know that sometimes people feel like, okay, well, it's anonymous, but it's safe. But just being able to create a space to write these down and share them, I think is really meaningful and powerful and helps others to read them.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and you guys have another interesting project called Grief in 6 Words. So what is that?
So this is another, again, we're always sort of looking for creative expression opportunities for people, ways to think about grief differently. And writing, of course, you'll hear people say all the time, you should journal, you should write. And we have a lot of resources for journaling if that is something that you like to do. But we would also often hear from people who would say, oh, I'm not a writer. I don't like to journal. That's not my thing. And at one point in talking about this, we were talking about the idea of 6-word stories, which there's an old, may or may not be true story about Ernest Hemingway, that he was in a pub with some friends and they challenged him or bet him that he couldn't write a short story in 6 words. And so he took their bet and he wrote the short story, Baby Shoes for Sale, Never Worn. And with that, I think just created really a movement of people who appreciated the power that 6 words can convey. And so with that, there are many people who've done many 6-word projects, 6-word memoirs, all sorts of 6-word projects. But we challenged people on our blog once to write a 6-word story about their grief. And we were flooded with responses, and the comments on Facebook and on our blog, we just had so many comments that people shared with us of 6-word stories. And we thought, this is such a shame for these to just live lost in our Facebook comments. So we put up a little website where people could continue to share their 6-word stories about grief, called Grief in 6 Words. And then we found that many grief centers, hospices, different places who read this on our site really, really liked this idea that even for people who aren't writers, even for people who are just, people who don't like to write at all, that 6 words feels manageable. It feels attainable, and yet it can still be so powerful. So we created that space, and people submit, and people, give us, their stories, and then we've been able to share them, and then they can self-submit their stories on the site. So it's been another really interesting project to be able to let people both share and connect.
And I think you did kind of a piece specifically around Children's Grief Awareness Day, where you asked for reflections specifically about children's grief in 6 words.
We did, and we actually got so many wonderful responses. And I know that when we did this, what surprised us was we got responses that were from children and parents who sat down with their children and did this activity with their kids and then submitted to us. But we also got a lot of really neat responses from adults who had lost parents as children and who now as adults really, I think this has always been true. Children's Grief Awareness Day, I think, really resonates with adults who were bereaved as children. And so I think we were really happy to see a balance of both, and that we received both of those things.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you for sharing that. We'll put the links also to that in case people want to either read what's come in and or submit their own
absolutely
stories themselves, or as you say, with their children or teenagers.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you guys have another project, I think, called Photo Grief. So what is that?
Yeah, so as you can probably tell, we're big believers in creative expression as a tool for coping with loss. And one of the things that Eleanor and I, when we first met and connected, though we were working professionally, when we connected about our personal loss and grief experiences, one of the things that we connected about was that photography was something that we both had used in different ways to cope with our own grief. And Eleanor has a background, a more formal background in photography, and I'm just a hack photographer with camera. But both of us found the process of taking photos in different ways as incredibly valuable and therapeutic in our own grief. And so we became really interested in researching that, learning about, are there other people doing this? Can we look at this from an art therapy perspective? What can we bring to this? And so we started kind of formalizing some of the things that we did informally and started writing about it, started using some research that was out there about it. And what we were overwhelmed by was the number of people who, when we posted about this, were like, yes, I do this too, or I'm interested in doing this too. And so we started sharing prompts. We started encouraging people to share their photos with us. We've created different hashtags. We do photo challenges pretty regularly on our Instagram, where every few months, where we'll do a month-long photo challenge where we'll post a daily prompt on something to photograph that's related to your grief. And we have many people who participate in that. We have a project we love called Would Have Loved This, which is a hashtag. So it's hashtag Would Have Loved This, where we encourage people whenever they encounter something in the world that their loved one would have loved to take the photo of it and to share it with the hashtag Would Have Loved This. So I think a lot of times we focus on memories that we have of the past, but we don't always take the time to acknowledge the things that, though sometimes very bittersweet, our loved ones didn't get to live to see. And, I always joke, my dad was a big beer drinker, and he died just before the craft beer movement was really taking off. And I always think anywhere I go somewhere with tons of beer on tap, or, so I think my dad would have loved this. And, any moments like that where you can just sort of take a photo and label this as, hey, this is a moment when I'm connecting with the memory of my loved one right now in the present.
Yeah, that's cool. And I think if somebody is interested in getting involved in this, but they're like, I don't know anything about photography, I wouldn't know where to start. You guys have a class, right?
We do. We have a class. So we have a class called Exploring Grief Through Photography, which is a self-paced class. So you can kind of take it in your own time. We know one of the things about grief is like committing can be difficult. You're overwhelmed. So when you sign up for that course, it was sort of created to be done over 6 weeks, but you can do it in the time and pace that works for you. And it really breaks down how to start thinking about this, not just technical pieces about photography. There's a little bit in there to help you improve your pictures, but a lot of it is just how to start thinking about what are some of these prompts, what are some of the stuck points that might be coming up for you in your grief that could be helpful to use photography as a tool to explore. We found one theme that many people have really used and resonated with is sometimes there are places or things in our grief that we avoid because they're too triggering, right? So sometimes people will say, I never go, I can't, my husband and I loved this park so much and I haven't been able to go back because I think it's going to be too upsetting. And we find that one thing people will often do when they take the course is sometimes they'll use it as a way to go back to some of those places or to connect with some of those things they've been avoiding, but almost through the safety of the distance of doing it behind the lens of a camera or doing it with a purpose, right? I'm going there with this reason to do something that's a little bit technical. So the thing about photography that I think can be really powerful and that the course really does is it taps into the emotional piece of what we're coping with. But then there's the creative, and then there's almost this technical kind of rational, if you're somebody who's got a little bit of an analytical brain, it does that going there and crafting the photo and thinking about what you want to convey that connects with those emotions. It kind of taps into all those areas and helps you think about how that might be something that you can use as you go forward in your grief.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Okay, you're getting me really excited about photography now. I'm not a photographer. I hardly know anything about it, but this sounds really cool.
Oh, well, we love it.
Yeah, neat. Okay. And I think you have several other classes as well. And then you mentioned earlier that you have webinars. So what's the deal with the webinars?
We do a monthly webinar series. So it's usually the last Thursday of every month. And it's a different topic every month. Usually we try to pick topics that people have been asking us about, emailing us questions about, things that we know people are looking for. And they're about an hour and a half. You just join via Zoom meeting. We send you a link. They're $10, but we never want people to not be able to join because of cost. So if cost is a barrier, just email us and we will make sure that you're able to join for either no fee or whatever you can pay. And then the recordings are available after the fact. So again, we know that oftentimes when we're grieving, we're only processing like 30% of what we're hearing or listening. So you can always go back and you can access the recordings again afterwards, for that support.
Mm-hmm. And I think you have one coming up in October called Supporting a Grieving Child, which sounds like it might be of interest to some of my listeners.
Absolutely. We did one in February that was on parenting while grieving, and now we're doing one and coming up in the fall on supporting a grieving child. And that one is really going to get into some understanding about developmental stages. It's also going to get into that really tricky line between what is grief behavior and then problematic behavior, what is normal grief behavior, and then what's just kids being kids. Because that's a question I think we always get from parents of I just know, like, what is this normal? Is this abnormal? Is this grief? Is this just my kid? I don't know. Yeah. And that's a hard question to answer, but we kind of give some tips and tools around that. And then we give a lot of ideas for creative coping as a family, ways to honor and remember together, activities that you can do with kids, a lot of art-based activities, but also just other types of remembrance activities. Thinking about milestones with kids, how you can talk to kids about incorporating the memory of their loved one at different milestones in their life, and make sure that on those days, that as a family, that you're able to acknowledge that part of grief is just that those days are always a little bit bittersweet when good things are happening, but this person that we wish could be here isn't here. And what do we do on those days to create space for that?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I'll put the link to that for sure. That sounds like really interesting, and maybe I'll have to join too. I'd love to.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Okay, so we're running short on time, actually, but I don't want to let you go before I ask about your podcast, which I know you're not currently producing new episodes, but I think you've got a wealth of episodes you've already released that are still out there and available. So can you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say we started podcasting. It wasn't the early days, but it was the earlier days of podcasting back in 2014. And part of what we do so much writing, but we know that some people really like to listen, and that's an easier way for people to access information. So we started the podcast with that goal in mind, and it is a very informal podcast. The episodes are, for the most part, Eleanor and I just talking through some of the common questions that we get, some of the challenging issues that people are facing in dealing with grief and loss. And we just go through and kind of take different approaches to that. And then towards the end, the more recent episodes, before we took our hiatus, we may get back to that podcast eventually, we actually started doing a lot more talking about some pop culture things around grief, talking about movies, talking about books, talking about things that might just be helpful in thinking about the ways that we can use the world around us to create conversation about grief, to think about how we process grief. So some of the more recent episodes, the last probably 4 or 5, deal with topics more of that nature. And then before that, we were digging more into specific challenges that people were facing.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you. Okay, so I just want to wrap up with one last question here that I ask all my guests. If you could say one thing to widowed parents, what would you say to them?
When I read this, I was like, oh no, I hate this. I hate the what's one thing that you would say, because there's so many things and everyone is so different.
Yeah.
But I think the one thing that I would say specifically to widowed parents, and I say this as both a professional and also someone who, though I wasn't really young when I lost my dad, my sister was younger than I was, and we were both young enough. And so the thing that I would always say to widowed parents is don't be scared to show your feelings in front of your kids. I think that it is something that we still hear so many. I just got an email yesterday from somebody saying, am I hurting my kid by crying in front of them? What am I supposed to do? And I think that fear, it's real for people. And so the thing I would always remind them that from professionals in the field and from children of, who've lost parents will often say, being able to see that my parent was sad is what gave me permission to feel like I could share that I was sad and that was okay. And it modeled that behavior for me and let me know that I could talk to them about my feelings. And so I would just always remind people that that's a good thing.
Yeah, such a good point. Such a good point. Thank you. Okay, I think that is a great place to end. So my guest today is Litsa Williams, who is the co-founder of the grief website, What's Your Grief? So Litsa, where can listeners find you and find What's Your Grief?
Yeah, so you can find us online at whatsyourgrief.com, and then you can find us on all the social media platforms except for Snapchat at What's Your Grief. So that's what we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube. Yep, just at What's Your Grief.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you, Litsa. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Litsa Williams as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 37. And Children's Grief Awareness Month is quickly approaching in November. If you know of anything going on in your area that you think I'd like to know about, please send me a note at jenny@jennylisk.com. I'd be happy to help get the word out on Twitter or Facebook about any local or national events or information that widowed parents might want to know about. By the way, you can find me on social media at LiskJenny if we're not already connected. And hey, one more thing. People have been asking for a flyer that they can give to a friend who's a widowed parent to let them know about the podcast. So I've got something in the works right now. I'll have both printed flyers and a downloadable document that can be shared by email. If you'd like printed or electronic flyers or know of a grief center who would, please send me an email and I'll get some to you as soon as they are ready. Again, it's jenny@jennylisk.com. It's JENNYLISK. I know there are many widowed parents out there, and my pie-in-the-sky wish is that every single one of them will find something useful in this podcast. Because I think that every kid deserves a chance to thrive, including those who lost a parent. And the surviving parent is key to that. That's why I'm doing this podcast, and I'm so glad you're here. So, hey, thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.